Shaquille O'Neal thought he was walking into just another interview, until the host, Richard Grant, blindsided him with insults and racist undertones on live television. But Shaq wasn't about to be humiliated. Instead of losing his cool, he flipped the script in a way no one saw coming. What started as an attempt to destroy Shaq's reputation quickly turned into the most unforgettable takedown in talk show history. And when the cameras stopped rolling, that's when Shaq made his most powerful move yet. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The bright lights of The Richard Grant Show gleamed over a packed studio audience. The energy in the room buzzed with excitement. Tonight's guest was none other than Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He had been invited to discuss his community work, a topic he was passionate about. Dressed in a sleek navy suit with polished dress shoes, Shaq walked onto the stage, flashing his signature warm smile. The audience erupted in applause, but behind the desk, Richard Grant, the show's host, merely smirked. Richard Grant was a seasoned talk show host in his 50s, known for his sharp tongue and controversial takes. Though he masked his biases well, those who worked closely with him knew the truth. His disdain for successful black athletes was something he never openly admitted, but frequently implied. In Richard's mind, these men didn't earn their way to success. They were just lucky. And tonight, he planned to expose Shaq as nothing more than a privileged giant who didn't truly understand struggle. Backstage, Emily Carter, the show's lead producer, adjusted her earpiece, watching the live feed with a sinking feeling. She had worked with Richard for years, and she knew his playbook well. He liked to bait guests, lure them into an argument, and twist their words for ratings. But this time, it was different. Emily had overheard his pre-show conversation with a staff member, revealing his real agenda. People see Shaq as this hero, Richard had sneered. But let's be real. Without basketball, he'd be just another guy off the streets. Let's see what happens when I push him a little. Emily clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about TV drama, this was personal. She considered warning Shaq, but if Richard found out, her career would be over. Still, a voice in the back of her head whispered, "Do the right thing." On stage, Richard leaned forward, his expression friendly but calculated. "Shaq, welcome to the show. Always good to have a man of your stature here. Literally." Shaq chuckled, adjusting his microphone. "Glad to be here, Richard. Appreciate the invite." The first few minutes of the interview were smooth. Richard asked about Shaq's childhood, his transition from basketball to business, and his work helping underprivileged kids. Shaq answered with his usual charisma, engaging the audience with heartfelt stories. But then, Richard's tone shifted. "So, Shaq," he said, leaning back in his chair, "let's talk about privilege." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "All right, let's talk." Richard's smirk widened. "You've built an empire, but let's be honest. How much of that is really your doing? I mean, being 7 feet 1 inch doesn't exactly make life hard, does it?" The audience murmured. The energy in the room changed. Shaq kept his cool. "Height helps in basketball, sure, but last I checked, being tall doesn't teach you business. It doesn't make you wake up at 5 a.m. to train, and it definitely doesn't make you give back to your community. That comes from who you are, not what you are." Richard chuckled, acting amused, but his eyes gleamed with something more sinister. "Fair point. But let's dig deeper. You talk a lot about giving back, but how much do you really understand the struggles of everyday people? You've been rich for decades. Do you think writing checks actually fixes poverty?" Shaq's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't take the bait. "I don't just write checks, Richard. I show up. I build schools, fund scholarships, and sit down with kids who feel invisible. I don't talk about it for show. I do it because it matters." Richard nodded as if considering the answer, then suddenly turned to the screen behind them. "Let's take a look at something, shall we?" A video clip began playing. It was an old news segment about Shaq's father, a military man who had been absent during much of Shaq's childhood due to deployments. The voiceover highlighted how Shaq had been raised by his mother, struggling at times. Richard turned back to Shaq with a mocking expression. "Your father was tough, but he wasn't around much, was he? Maybe that's why you feel the need to play the hero now." The room went silent. Shaq's entire demeanor shifted, He set down his coffee mug, exhaling slowly through his nose. His deep voice came out lower than before. "Careful, Richard. That's personal." Richard shrugged. "Oh, come on, Shaq. We're just talking here. No need to get sensitive." The audience wasn't sure how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing Richard had crossed a line. Others leaned in, eager for drama. Shaq, however, didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, studying Richard. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Setting up your little gotcha moment, trying to prove that I don't deserve what I have, that I'm just a lucky tall guy." Richard smirked. "I think a lot of people wonder that, Shaq." Shaq chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You know what's funny, Richard? I bet if I looked real close, I'd find you got a few things you didn't earn." Richard's smirk faltered. Shaq leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "Should we take a look?" Backstage, Emily's pulse spiked. She had seen this before, a moment where the power shifts. And Richard? He just realized he might have poked the wrong bear. The energy in the room shifted. What had started as a light-hearted conversation was now heading into uncomfortable territory. Richard Grant, seated across from Shaq, adjusted his tie and leaned forward, a smug smile playing at his lips. "So, Shaq," Richard began, his tone casual but laced with something deeper, "you've built an empire. No doubt about it. But let's be real. How much of that success was actually you, and how much was just genetics?" A murmur ran through the audience. Shaq arched a brow but kept his posture relaxed. He had been in interviews like this before. He knew how some hosts played their game. Shaq chuckled. "Genetics help, sure, but being tall doesn't make you put in the work. It doesn't teach you discipline. You think every 7-footer makes it to the NBA?" Richard smirked. "Well, let's put it this way. If someone else, say a random tall kid from the Bronx, had gotten the same coaching, the same exposure, don't you think they could have been you?" Shaq's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened. "You think talent and hard work don't matter?" Richard shrugged. "I think luck plays a bigger role than people like to admit." Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He knew where this was going. The implication was clear. Shaq wasn't great. He was just lucky. The audience, sensing the subtle dig, started shifting uncomfortably. Richard pressed on. "And then there's this whole giving back thing you do. It's great, really. Scholarships, community centers, all that. But do you ever think, maybe it's a bit disconnected?" Shaq tilted his head. "Disconnected?" Richard nodded. "Well, let's face it. You haven't struggled in a long time. I mean, how can you, a multimillionaire, possibly understand what it's like for the average guy working 2 jobs just to pay rent? Some might even say you're..." He paused for dramatic effect. "Not really black anymore." The air in the studio turned ice cold. A gasp rippled through the audience. Emily, watching from backstage, froze. Did he just say that? Shaq's expression barely changed, but there was a dangerous stillness about him now. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair. "So success erases identity?" "That's new," Shaq said, his voice calm but razor sharp. Richard forced a laugh. No, don't take it that way. I'm just saying when you reach a certain level, you're in a different world. You can't exactly relate to the guy working a night shift at a warehouse, can you?" Shaq let the question hang for a moment before answering. "You know, Richard, that's funny. Because last week I was at a warehouse talking to workers. Before that, I was in a school, helping kids who can't afford lunch. And the week before that, a homeless shelter. So yeah, I think I understand just fine." The audience erupted in applause. Richard's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. Okay, but let's take it a step further." He turned to the big screen behind them. "I want to show something real quick." A video clip played, a carefully edited news segment showing Shaq's luxurious homes, expensive cars, and private jet. Richard turned back to him. "I mean, come on, Shaq. You say you're connected to the struggles of everyday people, but you're flying in private jets. Isn't that a little hypocritical?" Shaq exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "You want to talk about hypocrisy, Richard? Cool, let's do that." Richard's smile faltered for real this time. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a calm, controlled tone. You want to talk about wealth? Okay. How about we talk about your salary? You make millions talking about issues while doing nothing to fix them. I fly private, sure. But last year I gave away more than your entire paycheck. And you know what? I'll do it again. The audience roared in approval. Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting Shaq to go on offense. He glanced toward his producers, looking for backup. Shaq continued. But let's be real. This ain't about money. It's about control. You don't like when people like me own things. You like us when we play ball, when we entertain, but when we sit at the table, suddenly it's a problem. A few audience members stood up, clapping. Richard forced another chuckle. Now, let's not turn this into something it's not. Shaq smirked. Nah, Richard. Let's call it exactly what it is. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie again. For the first time in the interview, he looked uncomfortable. Backstage, Emily couldn't hold back her satisfaction. Richard had pushed too far, too fast. And now, he was losing control. But what no one expected, what even Shaq didn't see coming, was that Richard wasn't finished yet. He had one last card to play, and this time, it was personal. The studio was silent, the energy shifting into something far more dangerous. Shaq's jaw tightened, his usually warm and playful demeanor replaced with something cold and unreadable. Richard Grant, sensing the weight of the moment, smirked like a man who thought he had just played the winning card. Behind them, the massive screen lit up with grainy old footage. A black and white clip played of a military officer, standing tall in his uniform. Shaq's father, Sergeant Philip Harrison. A deep voice narrated the clip, talking about the man's strict discipline, his long absences, and the sacrifices he made for his family. Richard leaned back in his chair, feigning sympathy. Your dad was a tough guy, wasn't he? But he wasn't around much, was he? A stunned murmur rippled through the audience. He didn't just say that. Backstage, Emily Carter clapped a hand over her mouth. Oh no, he's about to... She didn't finish her sentence because on stage, Shaq stopped moving entirely. His fingers, which had been idly tapping the armrest, went still. His chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths. Shaq's voice dropped an octave, steady and deep. Careful, Richard. That's personal. Richard didn't stop. He leaned in, pressing his advantage. I'm just saying, maybe that's why you feel the need to play the hero all the time, filling a void, perhaps. The tension in the room was suffocating. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his massive frame as still as a statue. You got one chance to back off. The audience was dead silent now, every single person on the edge of their seats. Richard, too arrogant to recognize the storm brewing in front of him, grinned like a man who thought he had won. I mean, let's be honest, Shaq, he continued, shaking his head mockingly. You love the attention, don't you? All this giving back stuff, all these donations. If you really cared about struggling people, you'd be in the streets, not just writing a check and feeling good about yourself. A low, sharp inhale came from Shaq. That was it. Shaq leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his massive hands clasped together. His deep voice rumbled through the studio like distant thunder. You sure you want to go down this road? Richard faltered, just for a second, but quickly masked it with a smirk. I'm just asking the hard questions, Shaq. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's because you know I'm right. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression eerily calm. Then, he turned slightly, addressing the audience instead of Richard. You know, he mused, voice as smooth as steel. I've met a lot of people like Richard. People who love to talk but never do. Who sit in their fancy chairs with their expensive suits, pointing fingers at folks actually out here trying to make a difference. Richard scoffed. Oh, come on, don't... Shaq cut him off, his deep voice slicing through the air like a blade. Nah, you had your turn. Now you're gonna listen. The crowd erupted in applause. Richard visibly stiffened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Shaq continued, eyes locked on Richard. You want to talk about my father? Let's talk. Yeah, he was tough. Yeah, he was gone a lot. You know why? Because he was serving this country, while men like you sat at home, judging from the sidelines. The audience roared in approval. Shaq tilted his head, his expression almost amused now. But let's be real, Richard. This was never about my dad. This was about you trying to break me. You thought you'd bring me on here, throw some low blows, make yourself look powerful. He leaned in closer, his voice lower, slower, sharper. But see, I don't break. The audience exploded in cheers. Backstage, Emily fist-pumped the air. Richard, for the first time, looked uneasy. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. Now, let's not get too dramatic. I was just... Shaq raised a hand, silencing him instantly. Let me tell you what's about to happen, Richard. When this airs, people are going to see you for who you really are, the man who tried, and failed, to bring me down. And when they do? Shaq leaned back, crossing his arms, grinning. You're finished. The audience was on its feet, clapping and whistling. Richard's face turned beet red, his fists clenching. But before he could speak, a voice crackled through the studio speakers. Richard? The voice belonged to one of the producers in the control room. Richard turned toward the camera crew, his expression sour. What? The producer hesitated. We just got word. The network execs are watching this live. And they want to talk. Now. A wave of panic flickered across Richard's face. Shaq's grin widened. Game over. Richard's mouth opened and closed, his face drained of all color. For the first time since the show started, he had nothing to say. Shaq stood, adjusting his suit. This was fun, he said, nodding to the audience. Y'all take care now. And with that, he walked off stage. The internet was about to have a field day. Backstage, Emily Carter's hands trembled as she stared at the message she had just sent. She had spent years putting up with Richard Grant's arrogance, his underhanded tactics, and, though he tried to hide it, his deep-rooted racism. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had gone too far. She knew Shaq could handle himself. He was a master at staying composed, even in the face of disrespect. But Richard had planned this ambush for months, and she couldn't just stand by and watch it happen. Shaq, it's a setup, she had texted his assistant, Derek, moments ago. Richard's about to push hard. He wants to humiliate him on live TV. Derek, sitting in the audience with a grim expression, immediately leaned over and whispered something to Shaq's manager. But Shaq had already sensed it. And now, sitting under the bright stage lights, Shaq leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms like he was settling in for a show. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Richard smirked, thinking he had Shaq right where he wanted him. What's wrong, Shaq? He said smoothly, adjusting his tie. Did I hit a nerve? Shaq let out a deep chuckle, calm, confident, and completely unfazed. Man, you worked hard on this, huh? He said, shaking his head. All these little mind games, the setup, the loaded questions. I gotta say, I'm impressed. Richard's smirk faltered just slightly. The shift in Shaq's energy was noticeable. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't even playing along anymore. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on his knees. Tell you what, Richard, he said, his voice smooth as steel. Since you're so interested in my success and where I came from, how about we take a little trip down memory lane? And then, he pulled out his phone. The audience watched in confusion as Shaq tapped the screen a few times. Then, a recording played through the studio speakers. A man's voice, Richard's voice, filled the room. These athletes think they're businessmen. They're just lucky. Without basketball, Shaq would be flipping burgers. The room froze. Richard's face drained of all color. The audience gasped, murmurs breaking out across the studio. Backstage, Emily clenched her fists, grinning for the first time in years. Shaq raised an eyebrow, watching Richard squirm in his seat. That you, Richard? Richard's mouth opened, then closed. That's taken out of context, he sputtered, forcing a laugh. That could be... Shaq smirked. Context? You want me to play the rest? The murmurs grew louder. The energy had completely flipped. Richard's confident facade was crumbling fast. This is ridiculous, he snapped, shifting in his chair. Where did you even get that? Shaq tapped his phone again, letting the clip play further. I don't care how much money they make. They'll never be like us. They're entertainers. That's it. The audience gasped again, even louder this time. Someone in the crowd shouted, "WOW!" Richard's face turned an ugly shade of red. This is an invasion of privacy. This is..." Shaq cut him off. "Nah, Richard, this is you." The audience erupted in applause. Cameras zoomed in on Richard's shaking hands. He was losing control, and everyone knew it. Shaq let the moment sink in, then casually slid his phone back into his pocket. "So," he said, leaning back again, perfectly relaxed. "You were saying something about success and privilege?" Richard was speechless. The control room was chaos. Producers scrambled to figure out what to do. Should they cut to commercial? Try to spin it? But it was too late. The internet was already on fire. Within seconds, Twitter exploded. "Shaq, you just ended this man's career on his own show. Imagine thinking you can outsmart Shaq. Richard Grant's days are numbered. Yikes." In the audience, Derek smirked as his phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Shaq had just flipped the entire script. Richard finally found his voice, but it was weak, shaky. "Look, I don't remember saying that. This could be doctored." Shaq shrugged. "Say less. I'll just send it to the network and let them verify it." Richard froze again. Shaq stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "It's been fun, Richard," he said smoothly, towering over him. "You enjoy the rest of your show." And just like that, he walked off stage, leaving Richard Grant sitting there, looking completely destroyed in front of a live audience. Backstage, Emily watched him go, her heart racing. She had spent years trapped under Richard's thumb, watching him manipulate, degrade, and humiliate guests for ratings. But tonight, he had finally been exposed. And Shaq didn't just win, he dominated. Richard Grant sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of his desk as the weight of Shaq's revelation crashed down around him. The studio was in chaos. The audience whispered in shock, the crew exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the control room descended into frantic shouting. "Cut to commercial, now!" Richard hissed, his face an unnatural shade of red. But the producers, many of whom had tolerated his arrogance for years, refused. "No, keep rolling," the executive producer muttered into his headset, eyes locked on the monitor. "The world needs to see this." The cameras stayed on. Richard swallowed hard, his once polished confidence completely shattered. Shaq, however, remained perfectly calm. His towering frame relaxed as he adjusted his cufflinks. "What's wrong, Richard?" he said smoothly. "You don't like the spotlight when it's on you?" The audience erupted in applause and laughter, making Richard flinch. This was his show, his platform, and somehow he had lost complete control. Then, something even worse happened. Twitter erupts. The clip goes viral. Within seconds, social media was on fire. Clips of the moment flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, spreading like wildfire. Tweets exploded across the platform. "Shaq just ended Richard Grant live on air. This is wild." Did this man really try to ambush Shaq of all people? LMAO. Bad move, buddy. "Fire Richard Grant" is trending #1 worldwide. In the audience, Derek's phone vibrated nonstop. He smirked as he scrolled through the thousands of comments pouring in. "It's over for him," he whispered to Shaq's manager. Backstage, Richard's assistant, Megan, stared at her phone, her hands shaking. One after another, messages from major sponsors flooded in. "Effective immediately, we are pulling our sponsorship of The Richard Grant Show. Please let Richard know our brand will no longer associate with him in any capacity. Given recent events, we are terminating our contract with Richard Grant. This is non-negotiable." Megan glanced up at the stage, her heart pounding. Richard was still fumbling for damage control, trying to salvage his career. She knew the truth. There was nothing left to salvage. As Richard desperately tried to compose himself, a news alert flashed on the bottom of the screen. Breaking. Talk show host under fire for racist comments. Major sponsors back out. The studio audience gasped. Even Richard, in all his arrogance, knew what that meant. Shaq saw the panic in his eyes and leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You thought you had power, Richard," Shaq said. "But the truth, it always wins." The audience roared in agreement, standing up and cheering as Shaq got up from his chair. He had no reason to stay any longer. The battle was over. And he had won. Richard Grant's downfall was swift and merciless. Within 24 hours, his name was plastered across every major news outlet, not as a celebrated talk show host, but as a symbol of disgrace. His career, built on years of manipulation and arrogance, collapsed overnight. The network executives held an emergency meeting the morning after the disaster. Sponsors had dropped out, social media was relentless, and advertisers were threatening to pull millions of dollars. Keeping Richard on air was no longer an option. When he arrived at the studio that afternoon, security stopped him at the door. "Mr. Grant," the head of security said flatly, "you're no longer allowed on the premises." Richard's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "This is my show." "It was," the security guard corrected. "The network just released a statement. You've been officially terminated, effective immediately." Richard stumbled back, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages, and worst of all, a notification from his lawyer. Contract terminated. No severance. No rights to show. Richard's breathing grew shallow. He had built this empire from the ground up, controlled every aspect of his show for years. Now, it was gone. Meanwhile, Shaq watched the fallout unfold silently, patiently, calculating his next move. He could have walked away and let Richard's career rot in the ruins. But that wasn't enough. He had a bigger idea. With a few phone calls and the stroke of a pen, Shaq made an announcement that shocked the world. He had just purchased the entire studio where Richard's show had been filmed. The headlines exploded once again. "Shaq buys the studio that fired Richard Grant, and what he does next will shock you." News outlets and fans cheered the poetic justice. The same stage where Richard had once used his platform to spread ignorance would now be a beacon of inclusivity, opportunity, and change. At the press conference, Shaq stood in front of the gleaming glass building, cameras flashing all around him. "This place used to be a platform for division," he said, his deep voice carrying power and conviction. "Now it's going to be a place where young voices, diverse talents, and real conversations can happen." Reporters fired questions at him, eager for more details. "What's the plan for the studio?" Shaq smiled. "We're launching a new talk show, and we're doing it the right way." A week later, the first episode of Shaq's new show aired, live from the very same studio Richard once controlled. But the first guest wasn't an A-list celebrity or a politician. It was Emily Carter, the producer who had worked behind the scenes with Richard, the one who secretly warned Shaq about the setup. As the cameras rolled, Emily finally spoke the truth. Working for Richard Grant was toxic, she admitted, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I saw firsthand how he manipulated guests, how he controlled narratives to fit his own agenda. And when things got ugly, he made sure the blame was always on someone else." Shaq nodded, letting her words sink in. "Why did you stay for so long?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Fear. I thought I had no choice. Until I realized..." She looked Shaq in the eye. "Silence makes you complicit." The audience sat in complete silence, hanging on her every word. Then, Shaq turned to the camera and said, "This studio is now a place for voices like Emily's, for people who've been shut down, talked over, or made to feel like they don't belong." The crowd erupted in applause. Shaq didn't just win, he built something greater. 7. The aftermath. A legacy of change. 1,000 words. Richard Grant had spent decades carefully building his empire. He had controlled the media narrative, manipulated guests, and used his influence to spread his version of reality. But now, his name was tainted beyond repair. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his career, Richard released a public apology video. His face was visibly strained, his usual arrogance replaced with forced humility. "I deeply regret my words and actions," he said, pausing as if searching for the right tone. "I was caught in a heated moment, and my comments were taken out of context. I never meant to offend anyone." The backlash was immediate. "Too little, too late. You got caught, not sorry. You had years to fix yourself." No sympathy. His sponsors didn't reinstate him. His network refused to take his calls. The world had moved on without him. With no job, no platform, and no credibility left, Richard Grant vanished from the public eye. Meanwhile, Shaq's new talk show wasn't just a replacement for Richard's, it was a revolution. Unlike the carefully curated, agenda-driven segments Richard used to push, Shaq's show was raw, honest, and full of real conversations. He invited guests from all walks of life: athletes, activists, struggling entrepreneurs, teachers, and even former critics. The show's slogan, "Truth over Talk," became a social movement. People finally had a space where they weren't manipulated, where their voices weren't silenced. It wasn't just a talk show, it was a platform for real change. And the best part? Shaq didn't just expose hate, he built something better in its place. One evening, after wrapping up another episode, Shaq stepped out of the studio and into the cool night air. The city skyline stretched before him, glittering in the distance. As he walked toward his car, he heard a small voice. "Mr. Shaq." He turned to see a young black boy, maybe 12 or 13, eyes bright with admiration, standing on the sidewalk, clutching a worn basketball. "You showed the world how to stand up to hate," the boy said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Shaq studied him for a moment, then crouched down so they were at eye level. He smiled and patted the kid's shoulder. "Always," he said. The boy grinned, holding his ball a little tighter. As Shaq stood and walked away, he didn't need cameras, a stage, or an audience to know he had made an impact. Because real change doesn't happen in viral moments. It happens in the people you inspire. If this story inspired you, don't let it end here. Stand up against hate, use your voice, and support those making a difference. Like, share, and subscribe to spread this powerful message. Drop a comment B